want to say a few words about biblical interpretation. Some of this material you have had before, you will have if you take classes on Scripture. But again, I think that in this context it's worth highlighting some of the things that have gone on and to provide maybe some tools for you and your Patronus. Scriptural interpretation has a long history. You can look it up in any introduction to the Bible or Bible dictionary or things like that, and you'll get a huge amount of information about it. So, and I've added some links down below to a couple of pretty good websites, I think, that have to do with biblical interpretation. But one of the things that I've always found striking is that we tend to privilege certain readings of Scripture, certain ways of reading, certain ways of interpreting. And there's some medieval patterns that we don't use very much anymore. And I just want to talk about those for a second and then give you some insights from Stanley Hauerwas, who was at Duke while I was there and still is. So Dante, the poet, talks about 4 ways of interpreting a text. He applies them to his own writing, but they're also applicable to Scripture. And so with any text, there can be as many as 4 different ways of reading it. The first is simply the literal interpretation of the events. That this happened. The second is known as a typological interpretation, not a literal interpretation, but a typological interpretation. So it connects events, let's say in the Old Testament, with events in the New Testament, maybe allegorizing things from the Old Testament into the New Testament, or from Old Testament time patterns into Christ's life. A third is what's known as either the moral or tropological interpretation, which has to do with how we act. And I'll give you an example of this in a few minutes. It's the moral of the story, for example. And then the fourth is known as anagogical, which has to do with future events described in this current text. So Dante writes that he says that there's the first sense derives from the letters, that is the very words, and a second from the things signified by the letters. We call the first sense the literal sense, the second allegorical or moral or anagogical. To clarify this method of treatment, consider this verse. When Israel went out of Egypt, the house of Jacob from a barbarous people, Judea was made his sanctuary, Israel his dominion, from Psalm 113. Now, if we examine the letters alone, the exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt in the time of Moses is signified. In the allegory, our redemption accomplished through Christ. In the moral sense, the conversion of the soul from the grief and misery of sin to the state of grace. And in the anagogical sense, the exodus of the holy soul from slavery of this corruption to the freedom of eternal glory. They're all sort of allegorical, but those are the 3 non-literal meanings. And medieval interpreters, earlier and later than Dante, used these means. They didn't want to limit Scripture to just the literal. That sometimes it just didn't make sense. They knew that things didn't make sense that way, and found other means to interpret them. Well, over the course of time, we've come into other ways of reading Scripture, other ways of interpreting it. And you know many of those: historical criticism, form criticism, redaction criticism, all of those kinds of things, all sort of part of the Enlightenment project and turning everything into sort of facts and observable, objective facts. And I like one of the things that Stanley Hauerwas has to say about this. He, in his book, Unleashing Scripture, very good book, He writes, "The fundamentalist and biblical critic share the assumption that the text of the Bible should make rational sense to anyone, apart from the uses that the Church has for Scripture. Fundamentalism and biblical criticism seek to depoliticize the interpretation of Scripture on the grounds that the text has an objective meaning," very counter to the medieval way of reading. "The result for both is a repoliticization of Scripture by giving unchecked power to some interpreters over Scripture without such power being justified." Who's doing the reading? Who's doing the interpreting? And if we're just going to rely on facts, what does that mean? And so he goes on further to write, he says, "The debate between fundamentalists and biblical critics is really more a debate between friends who share many of the same assumptions. The most prominent shared assumption is that the interpretation of the biblical texts is not a political process involving questions of power and authority. By privileging the individual interpreter, who is thought capable of discerning the meaning of the text apart from the consideration of the good ends of a community, fundamentalists and biblical critics make the church incidental." Now, certainly there's reason for doing biblical critical work. We do want to understand what the original text had to say. But our job in the church isn't to stop there. Our job in the church is to take it to the next step and to help those with whom we work understand what that text means. And we do that in the church, in the body of the church, with the church, in community. And so, just my words on interpretation. Again, check out the websites below and you'll see probably more than you want to know or need to know on various methods of interpretation, but it's good information.